Our second reading today comes from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 27, starting with verse 45. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, this man is calling for Elijah. At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Then Jesus cried again, and with a loud voice, and breathed his last. I got a call from my sister a few weeks ago. It was late in the evening here in Arizona, and even later in Texas, where she lives. We had had a text message conversation for quite some time before the call, and it was obvious through the content of her text messages that she needed someone to talk to. So when she asked if she could call, I said, of course, even though it was late and I was very tired. Because you see, my sister is dealing with a tragic situation. Her husband of nearly 38 years has been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, which next to Alzheimer's disease is the second most common type of dementia. Lewy body dementia, like Alzheimer's, is characterized by a progressive decline in mental acuity, but because it is also related to Parkinson's disease, it can also result in muscle rigidity and in tremors. Such is the case for my sister's husband. Before he was diagnosed, my brother-in-law was very active and talkative. In fact, some of us in the family said that he was often quite annoying, because he was always talking about something or always wanting to do something. He and my sister used to take a lot of trips every year. And in fact, there were many instances when my sister commented to us that his almost hyperactivity made her really, really tired. But since his diagnosis, he can hardly move. Getting him out of bed in the morning is a huge struggle for both of them. And the last time I saw him, which was a few years ago, he hardly spoke a word. So that night when my sister called, I knew she needed to talk about her suffering. I knew that she was struggling, and although she didn't actually say it, I could hear her asking those questions that we so often ask when we are dealing with these kinds of tragedies in our lives. Why did this have to happen to him? Why did this happen to us? Why? It's not unusual for us to ask the question why when tragedy strikes. In fact, in the short time that I have been in full-time ministry, I have met with many people who have asked that question, why? Like my former church member whose eyesight is gradually going away to the point where she is now nearly blind because of macular degeneration and retinitis pigmentosa. And another who was living with an abusive spouse. And many, many more who had family members who were very ill or dying. I've met with people who have experienced tremendous grief and loss, who are dealing with physical pain within their own bodies, and emotional distress that goes along with that. These are all faithful people who are struggling between the image of a good and loving God who, through their minds, are thinking that that God should not let these things happen to them, and the reality of the pain and suffering that they are experiencing in life. I've talked with Christians who are angry with God, who have felt abandoned by God. And while I'd like to say that their feelings are unusual, the truth is it's quite normal. Sometimes we find it hard to reconcile our image of God with the suffering that is going on in our lives. It's hard for us to understand who God is and how God works in light of our suffering. And that's one of the reasons why Reverend Adam Hamilton from Leawood, Kansas, wrote the book called Why? Making Sense of God's Will. It's also why he recommends that preachers preach about suffering at least a couple of times a year. Because at some point in our lives, we are all going to deal with suffering. Some of us more often than others. Remember what I shared about my sister in Texas. Well, she is no stranger to tragedy, I'm sorry to say. Her first husband, who was a captain in the Air Force, was shot down over Vietnam, and he was killed when his B-52 hit the ground. And just a few years before her current husband's diagnosis with Lewy body dementia, his son, my sister's stepson, committed suicide. And before that, one of my sister's grandchildren was born with a very serious liver disease, to the point where he was not even expected to live. Happy to say that that young man is now 24 years old and is married and is a college graduate. But tragedy and suffering has been a part of my sister's life for a very, very, very long time. And for many of us, it is a part of our lives and has been a part of our lives for a long time. So I need to ask all of you, how many of you have never suffered in your lifetime? I didn't expect any hands to go up, so I'm not at all surprised. We all go through times in our lives when we suffer. We go through times in our lives when things are not going the way that we had hoped them to go, or they're not going the way we had planned them to be. We might be suffering because of the actions of others in our lives, or because of something that we did to ourselves, or we might be suffering for simply no reason at all, or at least a reason that we can't identify. But what is clear is that suffering is a part of life. And I guess if there's any consolation to all of this suffering that we're going through, it's that we are not alone. Our little poll this morning showed us that we have all suffered at one point or another. Everyone suffers at some time in their life. Our history books are full of people who have suffered and their stories. Our Bibles are full of stories about the people who have suffered. In fact, this book is full of stories about Joseph and Jesus and many, many others who have suffered in their lives. For example, did you know that more than a third of the Psalms are what are called lament songs? Psalms? They were one of the ways that God's people expressed their complaints to God. Or as one blogger put it, these are the "it sucks to be me" songs. Yeah. Psalm 22, parts of which we heard this morning, is one of these, and it starts out very bleak. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish?" Sound familiar? It should. Because those are the very words that Jesus said as he was hanging, dying on the cross. Biblical experts believe that Jesus was quoting Psalm 22 as he hung there on the cross, a psalm that all Jews, all faithful Jews, would have known and would have recited in their heads right along with him. But of course, Jesus wasn't the only person that we find in the Bible who suffered great physical pain. He and so many others in both the Old and the New Testament are reminders that we are not the only ones who suffer. But let's get real, folks. Let's get real. When the suffering involves us, it really doesn't matter that the rest of the world is suffering, right? When we are dealing with tragedy in our lives, when we are dealing with our own pain, whether it's the death of a loved one, or physical pain, or the aftermath of a natural disaster, or the loss of a job, or a marriage, or a friendship, whether it is something that we did to ourselves or something that somebody else did to us, somehow knowing that others are experiencing the same kind of thing just doesn't matter. We want to know why these things are happening to us, right? We want to know why this is happening to us. Our logical minds tell us that if there is an effect, that there must be a cause. And if there is a cause, because we're all smart people, because God gave us a wonderful, wonderful brain, that we should be able to figure it out. We aren't content with knowing that everyone is going through the very same thing. We want to know why. We want answers. It reminds me of this flashlight. My logical mind tells me that as long as there is a power source, that this flashlight should work when I turn it on, right? Well, I'm going to turn it on. Oh, and there's just a tiny little bit of light left, but I hope that it's going to go out. There, it went out. We ran these batteries all night long. I guess Duracells are definitely, the kind to have. But assuming that, let's pretend like this flashlight is not working, we can assume that there was something wrong, right? My logical mind says, well, maybe it's the batteries. Maybe I need to put in fresh batteries. So if I put in fresh batteries and it still doesn't work, what do I do next? Well, maybe I look to the bulb. Maybe the bulb is bad. So I'll replace the bulb. My logical mind says, replace the bulb. We have fresh batteries. We have a brand new bulb. We turn it on, and it still doesn't work. What do I do now? What? Throw it away? Make sure the batteries are in right? Right. Well, now see, I expected somebody to say, go out and buy a new flashlight. None of you said that.
The socket for the bulb could also have some stuff.
Yeah, there could be other stuff that's wrong, but there does come a point when there is no satisfactory answer for why things happen the way that they do. There comes a point in time when we just have to say, I'm going to make a choice. I'm either going to continue down this path trying to figure out the answer to my question, why, and continue suffering right along the way, or I'm going to choose another path. I can continue to struggle, or I can rely upon the one who offers me comfort and strength through the darkness of my suffering. And in the end, as Adam Hamilton writes in his book, turning our backs on God doesn't change our circumstances, does it? What it does do, though, is it takes away the very source of comfort and strength that we need at that very moment. When Jesus was dying on the cross that day, he cried out in his humanness, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in that moment, he felt like he had been abandoned by God. And Jesus' example shows us that it's normal for us to feel the same way too. It's normal for us to get angry with God, and it's okay when we experience tragedies in our lives. It's okay for us to feel abandoned. But at some point, we do need to realize and remember that God has not abandoned us, even in our darkest, deepest despair. God is with us always and to the ends. I'm sure most of you are familiar with a poem called Footprints. There are many versions out there on the internet, but the original was written by a woman named Mary Stevenson, and it's a great illustration of what we're talking about today. It reminds us that God is our greatest source of hope and comfort, and we cannot turn away from God. And I'd like to read the poem to you. One night I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord. Many scenes from my life flashed across the sky. In each scene, I noticed footprints in the sand. Sometimes there were 2 sets of footprints. Other times, there was 1 set of footprints. This bothered me because I noticed that during the low periods in my life, when I was suffering from anguish, sorrow, and defeat, I could see only 1 set of footprints. So I said to the Lord, "You promised me, Lord, that if I followed you, you would walk with me always." But I have noticed that during the most trying periods of my life, there have only been 1 set of footprints in the sand. Why? When I needed you the most, you have not been there for me. The Lord replied, "The times when you have seen only 1 set of footprints is when I carried you." We may not always get an answer to why we suffer, but we can receive great comfort in knowing that God will never abandon us, even in our darkest hour. Our relationship with God gives us hope that tomorrow will be a better day. And may we always remember that even in our suffering, the Lord is always with us. And all of God's grateful people said, Amen.